So welcome. This is a presentation called New York City Real Estate for Artists. It's an overview of New York City real estate, specifically with creative people in mind, creative producers of all sorts. And it's being given by ArtCondo, and I'm going to jump right in. So welcome. So ArtCondo was formed to help artists and creative industries own their own spaces, which are a means of production, and to empower them with professional opportunities. So means of production, there's something a little bit political with that, but the goal is to help artists and creative workers to be able to own real estate and to anchor into communities and neighborhoods, specifically in New York City. So my name is Michele Gambetta, and I'm one of the founders of ArtCondo. I'm a licensed real estate agent at Bond, New York. I come from the visual arts. I have an MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York and a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And when I had this idea about ArtCondo, which I'm going to explain a little bit more, I got a certificate in real estate finance and investment from NYU. So that's some of the underpinning of my education for how I embarked upon this project. So when I came out of graduate school at SVA, I actually ran a mobile art show in the back of Ryder trucks. And it was in a guerrilla art project after 9/11. And I was organizing groups of artists to come together and to pool their money and their energy to create art shows and to give ourselves visibility. And so the shows, we were based in Brooklyn. I was based in Brooklyn at the time. And we did shows in Brooklyn. We did shows in Bed-Stuy. We came into Manhattan, into Chelsea, in front of the museums. We went up to Harlem. And the idea was to get visibility for our work, but then to be interacting with people and to be talking about art and to be kind of opening it up in a way. And after having been educated in the visual arts, this was really remarkable, because when you start talking with people about art, it really brings different things to the fore about it. And I was very influenced by the ideas of Joseph Beuys. And I'm mentioning all of this because ArtCondo as a project has this base, this foundation of this art project, which I ran for 8 years. So every year we did another show or 2 shows, traveled into a different place in New York City, interacted with people. And it really turned me on to like the power of art and artists and the importance of art and artists in society, like a healing force, like a cleansing force, bringing nutrition, bringing new ideas and new energy to people. And of course, when it's mobile, you're bringing that through the social body, which was very interesting. After the project ended, and I was working in real estate, and I was thinking more about artists coming together, and the market was turning, and a lot of things going on. I started realizing also that the project was very much about space. Like a Ryder truck, it's not a very big space, but it's a space. And for artists, when they have space, it's really kind of huge. It's key. And you can do so much when you have space, even when it's small. So those things of working with artists and creating culture together collectively brought me to this idea of ArtCondo, and to help artists gain equity, to help them stay in New York City. The power of collective action, of coming together, and the power of community is what ArtCondo is really about. So the project is meant to be helping people gain equity, become rooted in New York City. And I work with people to buy individually, to buy collectively, and then to do building developments and building conversions specifically to create communities, creative communities. And we're working on one project now. It's the first time for this very big project, but there's many, many lessons of working together as a group in real estate in New York City. So this presentation is an overview of real estate and the challenges for creative purchasers, And I'm going to focus on the real estate, but I'm going to touch upon some of the other challenges because it's meant to be a bird's eye view. And it's meant to give people some sort of grounding. I imagine you're probably a creative person if you're listening to this. And that's sort of the goal, because real estate is relatively technical, different aspects of it. And it's also very, very creative and it's very exciting. And it gives you so much opportunity if you can figure out how to have possession of it, essentially. So artists have financial challenges, they have cultural challenges, they have issues with, and this maybe building board falls under cultural in a way, but it's a very specific challenge people have in New York City. And then there's the real estate itself. So the financial has to do with financial literacy. Most creative people aren't spending a lot of time focusing on banking or economics. It's interesting, but it's not your life path. But you do want to have rules of thumb. You want to know as much as you can. This is a very quickie overview. It really could be its own presentation. You will need a cash down payment. The more you have, the better it is. All the inventories, maybe with a small exception if you're a veteran, and there's some very good veterans loans, but you really do need cash and some cash. Your credit score. Your credit score is another thing, is if you're thinking about buying, not now, even in the future, you want to work on your credit score. You want to check it. You want to fix it. Again, it's not always people's primary, thing on their head, but it's important. Banks, when they're trying to determine if you can get a mortgage, they do an underwriting process. They're looking at your income, they're looking at your credit score, they look at how much assets you have, what sort of debt you carry, and then they look at the property itself. If you're self-employed, if you're an artist who is selling your work, or maybe you're a graphic designer, you don't have a W-2, you're not paid in a very consistent way. That makes you a more challenging person to loan to, but it is possible. And it needs to be looked at more. You probably have to work on preparing yourself more. And generally, you want to start preparing yourself like 2 years out, working with an accountant to kind of finesse your the way you present yourself, because often independent people also write down so much more than other people. Um, so this is just kind of, an overview. And when you're really ready to buy, you need a mortgage pre-approval. You need to know your purchasing power. Like, I understand people want to spend the least they can. They work hard for their money, but you want to know the most you can buy, so then you back into what you can buy. And then you can work with a mortgage calculator and your agent to understand what your monthly payments would be with your mortgage. And then there's property taxes and maybe maintenance, and there's other things that go into it. But this financial literacy is really important if you want to own real estate. So cultural, creative people often are driven by a value system, right? And some of those values often have to do with like a sense of community, connecting with people, networking, working a lot. Um, when you've lived in a creative community, there's often resource sharing. People like to recycle. They like to share if they're going to throw it out. Maybe you can use it. Why waste it? Diversity of income, race, discipline. So it's hard to find buildings that are composed of creative people in New York City. They've been kind of, they're hard to find. They've been pushed out. That's part of what ArtCondo is trying to do and create. So that's one side of it. It's hard to find buildings with those shared values, but artists can also be discriminated against because of those values, because there's stereotypes about those values. And so, this is a very like intangible thing, but I think values are very, very important, and it has to be thought about, or should be thought about. And I'm mentioning it here. It's a challenging thing, honestly. And the value system leads into, and stereotypes lead into this idea of board approval. and how it can sometimes be very difficult for artists to get approved by boards, particularly co-ops. Um, Co-ops can turn people down for any reason. They have a board process. They don't have to tell you why they turn you down. Their process is very stringent. They have very high hurdle usually for letting people in. It's almost like you're applying to college again. um, and you know, sometimes it's almost like a proctology exam with the amount of detail you have to give in your co-op application. There are industry standards. Again, this has to do with stereotypes. Like, you want to fit into these industry standards if you're buying a co-op, because it will work against you if you are not. Uh, if not, everything needs to be very, very clear with a co-op. And the reason is that because it's not real property, because everybody is part of a corporation and owning shares, they're a little bit more concerned about who is part of their business together, who is part. So my recommendation, especially if you're thinking about a co-op, is to use a real estate professional. That would be my recommendation overall in general in New York City, but especially with a co-op. So real estate, this is probably the reason that you're here. And finding real estate that you want that would work for you is a process. And I've broken out like three sorts of things, qualities, features that you need to be thinking about if you're not looking for just a straight residential. And even straight residential, you might be thinking about these. So first is just the space itself. Like, what's its vibe, right? Like, do you want to be in it? Most artists want something open, raw. They want it to have character of some sort, because they would like to shape it a bit. This can be hard to find in New York City, where so many things are renovated, but they exist and they can be found. The zoning. Now, use and zoning, when it's residential, when you just want to live somewhere, that's the use, that's the zoning. All the residential places have that use. If you want to work in your space or work in your space, it becomes much more complicated, and it really and more technical, and it has to be thought through, thought through. And then there's the actual physical building structure, right? So, oh, it's great, it's open. Oh, it will support my use, but I also need to be able to weld. So I need concrete floors. I want to have light. I need northern light, ventilation, electrical capacity. If you work with really large sculptures or really large paintings, do you have access? Do you have 24-hour access? So these sorts of things, build a ceiling height, right? Every creative person has a different set of what they must have needs. There's needs and wants, and if you're using the space to work in, you know what you really need. And so when you look at the space, it has to be able to either have that, or can you make it? Can you renovate it to put it in? And like ceiling height, well, if the ceilings are 9 foot and you're buying in a condo or co-op, you're never going to change it, right? If you buy in a building, maybe you could raise the ceiling. What does that cost? What is the process? Generally, I think that's a pretty expensive change. I'm speaking without really fully knowing. I haven't priced that out. You would want to work with an architect and get some real and a contractor to get some hard costs. But some things you're going to know. If you need concrete floors and they're wood and you need to weld, it's not going to work for you. So it needs to be seriously considered when you're shopping for something to buy. So many artists want live workspaces, and there are legal live workspaces in New York City, which are called Joint Living Working Quarters for Artists, JLWQA. That's Joint Living Working Quarters for Artists. However, they're a very small inventory in New York City, and they tend to be expensive. They're grounded in zoning. And the zoning where they exist tends to be downtown, Soho, some Flatiron. Um, and they're, you know, they're not super common. They're around, but they're not super common, and they need to be um, searched for in specific ways. So given that there are very few places that you can legally live and work in the same place. With ArtCondo, we've been working on alternative but still legal approaches to help people live and work as they want to. Um, and that is a lot of what I do think about, especially when I'm helping people purchase individually, because you know, it's a lifestyle. It's something that most people who are creative, who have chosen it as a life path, have chosen it as a life path, and they want to do it. So again, you need to be looking at the use, your use, the zoning, how much square footage you would want, the building type, I didn't include that here, but then the building structure, how much square footage you would need for living or for working, and then the type of financing. If you need commercial space that is more than residential, you could go with certain financing. If you want more residential than commercial, then that can be different financing. And usually the cutoff is 49 or 51%. Um, and again, that needs to be sort of thought through. And I'm going to go into a little bit more the differences between commercial and residential, just to really break it down so you understand. But it's a little bit of a teeter totter. And 49 and 51% are somewhere where the things begin to pivot. So in New York City, there are three types of districts which have to do with the zoning and which has to do with this question of use and wanting to have a workspace, wanting to have a living space, etc. There's residential, which is all types of places you can live in, and I break it down in the next slide. There's commercial. There's essentially two types of commercial space. There's the C zoning, which are basically clean spaces, office, retail, service. And then there's the M, which is manufacturing, which is like dirty, you know, it's the welding, the places you could make noise, the places you can make smells, the places that usually are not close to the residential because they have some toxicity to them. And then there's community facilities, which have some community benefit to them. So this is just a quick breakdown of like residential. And again, I'm going to go through all these. You have condo, co-op, single family, two family, townhomes, multifamily, all fall under the residential zoning, R1 through R10. Commercial zoning is the M and the C. You have mixed use buildings, manufacturing buildings, commercial office buildings, commercial condos. And in both cases, you have empty land, which the land has the zoning. So that's how people know what they can build on the land, because the land has the zoning. And then there's community facility, which are basically nonprofits and businesses which benefit the community. So you want to have doctor's offices around, dentist offices, art therapy, childcare centers, libraries, nonprofits, cultural organizations. Those fall under the community facility district. So this is a screenshot from the zoning resolution, New York City's zoning resolution, which is essentially a set of laws. And it's a crazy thing to read. You can find it online. It's like archaic, like legal, like it's very dense. It's very specific, but it's essential for cities and New York City specifically. It has to do with quality of life, and it has to do with how dense the city's different neighborhoods are, and it has to do with safety. So it is important, even though it's really you know, something you have to like get used to. And it defines things, like it defines how high a building can be built, how much square footage you can build on a place, setbacks so that there's light and air behind buildings so that you don't have buildings all cramped together, fumes, sound, parking, affordable housing, even bicycle storage, even I said parking, like sometimes on certain lots, you have to put parking spaces. And the way it's broken out, you'll see here, these R's under the orange, those are all the residential. The C's are all the commercial, and the M's are the manufacturing. And then as you go down this chart, you have the use groups. So 1 and 2 are all the residential use groups. So you can do use group 1 in like R3 to R10 because it's colored gray. This residential use group you can do in C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6 in mixed use buildings, but you can't do them in C7 or C8 if a lot has those sorts of zonings. And this is very, very specific throughout. And it defines, like you see in manufacturing, you can't have a residential use group in any of the manufacturing. And usually these are districts because similar types of real estate are in similar districts and zones. So you typically won't find a concrete plant, right, which is in a manufacturing, maybe heavy manufacturing. You won't find that usually next to like houses. They're usually separated, and it would go like from M3, and then next to that would be an M2, and then an M1, which is lighter, and then it's next to more residential. This is another page from a part of a page from the zoning resolution. And this is just to give you just a little bit more insight into how specific it is, because here you have different types of businesses or businesses, you could say, right? They are given specific use groups, like going back to that prior slide, and then you can see again where they fall into the zoning. So an art gallery, there's a commercial art gallery, and then there's a non-commercial art gallery. They're distinct. They can be in distinct types of zoning. There's some overlap, but not completely. So a commercial art gallery, for example, can be in an M1, M2, or M3 zoning. A non-commercial gallery cannot be in an M2 or an M3. It can be in a residential though. It can be an R1, R2, R3 to R10. This commercial gallery cannot be in an R district. So when you're looking into, sorry, it's very like detailed. When you're looking into buying something and even renting something, because all of these laws apply for renting also, you need to be working with someone who really understands this and who has a team which can help you buy something which is really appropriate for your use. So I have a few slides with some real estate terms, which to give you just additional insight into, hey, you're thinking about buying a building or you're thinking about buying an apartment, and how does it all work? So floor area ratio is a really important term when it comes to buildings. This has to do with a ratio of essentially how much square footage you're allowed to build or to have on any one specific lot. And so it starts with one FAR has to do with the floor, has to do with the lot square footage, the lot size. So in this example here, you have a lot that's 100 by 100. And so that's 10,000 square feet. So if you owned or somebody owned a lot that was 100 by 100, they could build 10,000 square feet on that lot. Now, that 10,000 square feet can be configured in different ways. It can be 2 floors that are 5,000 a piece. It could be 4 floors that are 2,500 square feet a piece. Now, most of you are not doing development, so you say, well, what does this have to do with me? Well, it has to do with you because possibly you find a house or a building which has an FAR, which is like 2 FAR. And it's only built 15,000 square feet. I mean, these are bigger numbers I could be using, but it's just an example. Essentially, you can buy something which isn't maxed out for its FAR. So you can build square footage on it. So you can buy it for the price of what's existing, and then you can build onto it. And sometimes you can build higher, sometimes you can build back. All of that gets into the details of the zoning resolution and an architect, but it's very good to know what this term is when you're looking at properties. Price per square foot, you see it all the time. Essentially, that's the price you're paying per square foot, and this is how you can potentially compare apples to apples. Now, if you're buying for yourself to use, like, and it's especially used by real estate professionals, if you're buying for yourself to use as a consumer, you generally, it's not only about the price, it's about finding something you really love and you really can work with. And so the price per square foot is important, but it's not critical. But it's essentially the price divided by the number of square feet. When you see APP is the average price per square foot, and that can be a way to understand what's the going price in a neighborhood or within a certain type of inventory. And it's useful to know, it's a reference. So we're kind of straddling, we're talking about commercial real estate and residential real estate. And I want to give you some more like bird's eye view for what the difference is and the similarities between the two types of real estate, because they really are distinct, even though there are some cases where they overlap. And for you to think about in terms of what you really want. So as we mentioned before, the use, the zoning, they're different. Residential, R is for living, commercial is for different types of working. Now the financing is also very, very different. Commercial properties have a higher hurdle. You usually have to put more money down to buy them. They're typically geared toward professionals and business owners and not just consumers. And so they can be more difficult to buy. There is a very good SBA loan, which for anybody who is incorporated as a business, even if you're a selling artist, right? You are a small little business. You can be eligible for this SBA loan, and it's a very good loan. It's like 10% down versus the typical, which is 35 to 40% down. So that is very good to know. And with residential, it varies. It can be as much, as low as 3%, 10%, 20% is more typical. However, the commercial just is harder. There's also a difference in the buyers who you're competing with when you're purchasing for exactly the reason I'm saying. The buyers for commercial tend to be professional landlords. The buyers for residential tend to be consumers, and it's for themselves. So you could be, and in New York City, where there's so many people who do have access to funds, you can be competing even with residential against an all cash buyer. But there's a larger chance you'll be doing that when you're buying commercial. And then there's costs and how things are valued. So in general, the price per square foot of residential is higher than commercial. Commercial, maybe because it's considered wholesale purchase, you buy more, it's larger usually, but the price of commercial is lower. You also usually can't live there, so that's part of it too. Living someplace is valued higher. But the property taxes with commercial are higher than residential. In New York City, commercial properties are essentially subsidizing the residential. So that's important to be thinking about when you are looking at what your costs are and whether you can carry whatever you're proposing, whether you can pay for it. And then property valuations is related to the price per square foot. Now, the similarities between residential and commercial are the realities of New York City real estate, which is a very good market, a strong market, annual appreciation. The appreciation varies by borough. Brooklyn was appreciating 5 to 6% annually over 10 years. So every year, the property values in Brooklyn were appreciating. Now, 5 to 6% is really pretty good. It's pretty amazing, especially if you're living in the space and you're also getting that value. Um, Manhattan is less, is like 3%, but you don't have as strong a market in most other places. New York is a unique market. It's a harder market to get into for both residential and commercial, but it's a very good market. It's also a very efficient market. It's very data driven and relationship driven. Um, it's harder to get what people like say like a good deal because things move so fast, and those really great deals move exceptionally fast. Um, but yeah, that is what it is. Like you want to look for something that works for you and really think about the long haul. You shouldn't be buying if you're thinking about just owning for 3 or 4 years. You know, 8 to 10 years makes it worthwhile. And then if you bought even a little high, you'll still be ahead. It's that holding period and that appreciation, which really adds up. And then there's variables when you're purchasing or renting in New York City, which I believe I have another slide about this, which are the same, which are price, location, and size. You know, it's not calculus to buy something, but there's these three variables which are interrelated, and when one goes up, the other one goes down, and you need to realize that to stay realistic. You really can't always get what you want. Not even people with like amazing budgets, they have to compromise. And this purchasing is a process. And I think it's a very organic process. And you want to start broad and you want to have a lot of communication, and then you want to focus. And you know, if you want an amazing location, a prime location, you're either going to pay a high price, or you're going to get a small space. You know, if you want the lowest price possible, you're going to have to get a location that's far out from the center or get a small size. If you want the biggest space possible, you're either going to have to be far out or pay more. And that's what I mean about the variables. So when you're thinking about buying, you want to have a team. You want to have a real estate agent, a buyer's agent who's really your coordinator and your overseer, who's making everything gel together. You need a lender. You need to get a mortgage pre-approval. You need a New York City real estate attorney, not your cousin in Ohio who's not going to do it for free. New York City is very, very specific. And a lot of people don't really know the inventories. And especially if you're buying a condo or co-op and you have people who have to go through, do the due diligence, you want someone local. And then a home inspector, not necessarily for a condo or co-op, but definitely for buildings or houses. And then if you're renovating, you want to have an architect on your team who can bring a contractor, or you can bring your own contractor, because you want to have an overview of costs. So that's kind of the overview. Now I'm going to talk about the different properties that are residential and that are commercial. And hopefully you'll learn something new here that you haven't known about the different inventories in New York City. So we're going to start with a condominium, a condo as it's known. These are usually post-war. They're usually new construction. They're usually, you know, luxurious, investor-friendly, often have many building amenities. They're real property. 10% down is pretty common. It does depend on the building, but 10% down is pretty common. And of course, you can put more. But they're okay with foreign buyers and investors. And this is a big thing. And this is the reason some people buy them, is so that they can put their money into a hard asset, which then generates income for them. And so that can be great, but you have to realize that it also affects the building and the tenor of the building in some way. I mean, it's very, very different than a co-op where you usually can't rent out, you can't sublet out. But it's kind of like an investment property, essentially. But people live there, of course, too. They're priced higher. They can go up to $2,500 a square foot. Those are very, very fancy. Um, they're priced higher than co-ops, but there's very few restrictions. So people like the lack of restrictions. Cooperatives, co-ops. There's many, many co-ops in New York City. It's actually the largest inventory type that is owned. Um, they're often pre-war buildings. And what differentiates them from condos is that your ownership is you're becoming part of the corporation with the other people of the building. So you're essentially going into business with them and you have shares, which reflects the money you paid. And then you get possession of your apartment through a proprietary lease. And this is like something that for people who aren't familiar with them, who aren't familiar with New York City, is sometimes like a little odd for them or they don't understand it. But in New York, New York attorneys, New York real estate people, New Yorkers are very familiar with this and it works very, very well. People get, they're harder to get into and they're like, and because of that, they also can be more secure. They often require 20 to 40% down payment. They often require post-closing liquidity, which means you have to show in your bank that you have maintenance to cover 3 months, 6 months, a year's worth of maintenance, because they're trying to protect themselves and protect the corporation from if you lost your job and you couldn't pay the maintenance. They look at your debt to income so that they know how much debt you have and they see if they really want you in their building to be not just a neighbor, but like a business partner, essentially. So there's many restrictions and that's, the reason is because you're becoming a partner, but those restrictions are also why people sometimes get turned off with co-ops because the boards, depending upon who's in the building, can be a little bit onerous, just like applying for them can be onerous, can be very, you feel like you're giving your third child or something. And they often restrict subletting. So even if you were going to Europe, you got a sabbatical or something for a year, maybe just 1 year, many of them would do, but if you wanted to rent out for longer, most of them wouldn't, or they got different rules about it. So when you're looking to buy a co-op, you really need to dig into those rules to know if it's right for you. So then there's HDFCs. So these are co-ops and they were created and still are created sometimes for middle income New Yorkers. They have a subsidized price. They have subsidized property taxes. Their price per square foot is really low. It's like half of condos. They're often pre-war. They're often very cute. They often have a lot of character and you can get a lot of space often, excuse me. Now their restrictions are income caps. So they were created for middle income New Yorkers and the city wants to keep them for middle income New Yorkers. So the caps have to do with the percentage of the AMI. They often also require post-closing liquidity. They are a co-op. They do have restrictions too, but the amount of space you get is remarkable. And I think they're a great option for people who, especially people who like, if you have a lump of money and you don't necessarily have a high income, right? So you can come in and you can buy something and then you don't have high maintenance. So there's something really to look at, but they definitely look to make sure that you're under the income caps. And something you have to be careful with your agent, your real estate agent, and your attorney when they're doing their due diligence is to make sure that the building is financially sound. These I hope this is recording. Hold on a second. Okay, it's going on. Oops. Let's see if I go back. Oh. Anyway, I'll go to this next one, but you want to make sure the building is financially sound. That's very, very important. some of them aren't, and your attorney and they require all cash purchases. You can't get a mortgage, and that's a red flag that you have to really look into. So single family, two family, and three family homes. So these are homes that are less in Manhattan, that are more in the boroughs, but I think they actually are a really good choice for creative people to consider, because you get a lot of space. They have basements, they have attics, they have backyards, they have parking. Sometimes you can put an accessory shed in the back. You could put a greenhouse. They often have FAR that you could build onto them. There's few restrictions. You own the whole house. Although sometimes you could buy it and you could take a single family and turn it into a two family. And it could maybe become some sort of retirement strategy for yourself. So I think, and I think that a lot of, especially people who are coming from Manhattan, don't think about this inventory, but in the boroughs, they are thought about. And sometimes the down payment can be lower, depending upon what loan you get. You know, with the other ones, with condos and co-ops, you have to follow the building rules. Here, you are the building, and the bank also has a little bit more freedom with them. And you get a deed, so you own the whole thing. Townhouses are similar to single family and two family in that you get a lot more space. These are a lot of townhomes are up in Harlem, out in Brooklyn. I think they have an aesthetic appeal, which is they're very beautiful. And again, you buy the whole building. You could buy the building and break it up with other people. People take different floors. There are ways to do that. Often there's a garden apartment on the lower level, which goes out to the back, and then you get onto the parlor level. Again, there's few restrictions with these aside from, except you want to do your due diligence. They're older buildings. But you know, you can maybe put something on the roof. You know, they have a basement, they have a garage. There's a lot you can do with these. So that's residential. So that's most of residential. I didn't mention land. I have a slide for the land under the commercial. But you can also start with just a piece of land. But let's get into the commercial. So mixed use buildings. Now, what is this? What does this mean? You see them throughout New York City. The ground floor is retail. This is the commercial. This is a C zoning. And up here are residential. So they're separated. You really can't take this retail use and put it on the second or third floor here. These floors are zoned residential. This floor is zoned commercial. However, as a creative person, you could maybe commute from your second floor to your first floor, and you could have your office down here, or you could be painting down here. You can renovate them. You own the whole thing. You have a deed. You're responsible for the building. Typically, they need a commercial loan. It does depend building to building on how much square footage is residential and how much is commercial and how many units there are. It gets very specific. But this is the type of building that also could potentially fall under an SBA loan. So I think that they are good for people to think about if they really want to be in, have the ability to live and work in exactly the same place and not have a true commute. This is a mixed use building in Manhattan, a little bigger, a little bit more fancy. You see up here that they built something set back. There's an additional floor up here on the very top. They put it up, they had FAR and they added that. And then they have, this almost looks like it might be like some sort of boutique or something. But you can see the entrance here, which is going up. And, you know, they're case by case with these buildings. So manufacturing industrial, you see these all over Brooklyn. It's a commercial use. It's a dirty industrial use. It's a factory building. You get a deed. You would be responsible for your maintenance and your property taxes, like all the others. All the others are the same. You also have property taxes. I didn't actually mention that. With co-ops, it's just different that they combine the taxes with your maintenance, but everything else has property taxes. A building like this could be purchased and co-opted or condoed so that people get discrete spaces. It's a process. Um, and but you need to be able to achieve, purchase the whole building. That's the hurdle. Because usually you need about 40% down unless you do an SBA loan and you're using at least 51% of the building yourself for your business. This is an example of an industrial building in Bushwick, which I was I came across. And beautiful, beautiful building. It's zoned commercial, but there were some artists in it who renovated the whole thing, and they made it so that it could be used for residential, but the zoning is commercial. This is another example of a commercial building, but this one has legal residential zoning. So a piece of this, I think it's the second floor, is legally able to be used for residential with what's called a caretaker's apartment. So they went through a process with the DOB of taking a commercial building, an industrial building, and adding this apartment to it for residential. This building also has additional FAR, so you could build almost 1,000 square feet onto it to use. I mean, it's so cute, and I would hope that anyone who did it would do it with some architectural aesthetic, some consciousness of beauty. You have to see. This is another example of an industrial building. This is out in Brownsville that I had seen for sale. It's actually this one with the low and then the higher one here. Very, very good price, $185 per square foot. And it's overbuilt. So when it's overbuilt, they can't take it away from you except if you start some sort of renovation process, and then the DOB can make sure you stay within the laws. But these areas that are east of Broadway Junction or right around Broadway Junction do have better priced inventory. It's just very industrial, and you have to want to live or work or commute into something that is really, really so industrial. So this is an example of a commercial building, one of these C buildings, which is for retail, clean working space. This whole building could be owned with one deed. What's sometimes happening, one landlord, very good business model. Sometimes whole floors are sold, the whole building is condoed and whole floors are owned. It's something that's happening more. But again, to buy something like this, you would have to usually have at least 40% down or get a loan. This is an example of a commercial condo in Greenpoint, only working space, $558 a square foot, which is a very good price actually, no living. It had some assessment, but there are very, very few of these around, which was part of the reason ArtCondo was formed, was to create more of this inventory. And this is an example of a multifamily building. This is a rental building. It's falling under the commercial category here because if you were to finance it, you'd need a commercial loan. However, it's zoned residential. So it gets a little confusing, like where does it belong? But when it comes to really trying to acquire things like this, the financing is key. And so thinking in that way of like, well, how do I do this? It's good to know what category it falls under. Again, you had a deed. If you were you had landlord, then you would rent them out. And so this is an example of land. This land is a way to acquire something. This is land that ArtCondo actually purchased with a group of artists in the South Bronx, and I have a slide or two about that. Land is an option. You can find out The zoning of the land is advertised with it when it's for sale. So you know what can be built on it, and then you can explore whether that financially makes sense or not. There's a lower upfront cost to buying a piece of land. You can design your dream space. The soft costs are higher with something that's not already existing. And the cost of labor in 2021 is higher than buildings that were built in 1930, right? So that's something you have to think about. In terms of building something though, in general, you can project your costs in a more clear way when you're building from the ground up versus renovating something. Renovating something, it could be the better way to do it. I'm not really sure. But there are a lot of hidden costs when you're renovating something. So with a piece of land, you have a deed, you own the land, and you can do 10% down, often because it's a lesser cost. It's all cash purchases, but you can also finance the land. So this is what we're planning on building on this land. That picture was taken in the spring. This is a 7-story building, supposed to be live work spaces for artists, zoned residential, but you can work in them. Large windows, high ceilings, and it's an investment model. So it's not a typical purchase, but it's a different way of approaching how do you help artists stay in New York City? And this is something that we've been working on with ArtCondo, and is like kind of the master project where there's so much learning that is involved in a project like this. And so, yeah. And this is where it is in the South Bronx. So it's on 152nd Street, which you can see is very, very close to Harlem, very, very close to Manhattan. And that's it. So please reach out if you have any questions. I'm working, as a real estate agent. If you're interested in learning more about what we're doing in the Bronx, if you're interested in purchasing something, we're working on helping ArtCondo to be a resource for New York City artists. And would love to hear from you. Call, say hi. Okay, thanks so much.